Nestled in the heart of the city, Le Ciel Blanc stood as the epitome of luxury and exclusivity. It was a restaurant where the rich and powerful came to dine in style, tucked away on a quiet street in an upscale district. The restaurant's pristine white exterior was adorned with intricate gold accents, giving it a regal look. As the evening sun began to set, the large windows reflected the glowing lights of the city, creating a dazzling effect that could be seen from blocks away. Before we move on to telling this story, we want to hear your opinion. Write to us in the comments, what is your name and where are you looking from? Your support is very important to us and helps our growing channel to develop and reach more people. Every comment, every like, every post brings us closer to creating a community that defends justice. Thank you for participating with us in this important event. Inside, the ambience was one of quiet sophistication. Soft classical music played in the background as elegant chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the polished marble floors. The tables, draped in white linens, were set with fine china and crystal glasses that gleamed under the lighting. Every detail of the restaurant was meticulously curated, from the expertly crafted menus to the luxurious decor, aimed at creating an atmosphere where the elite could feel at home. The walls were adorned with art from world-renowned artists, and the air was rich with the scent of exquisite gourmet dishes being prepared in the kitchen. Le Ciel Blanc wasn't just a place to eat, it was an experience, a way of life. Guests weren't just looking for food, they were looking for a sense of status, a reflection of their success. On this particular evening, the restaurant was at its peak. The restaurant's usual clientele, made up of influential businesspeople, politicians, and celebrities, were scattered throughout the room. Their laughter and soft conversation blended with the clinking of glasses and the gentle hum of the waitstaff moving in and out of the kitchen. It was an evening that was typical for Le Ciel Blanc, until two new patrons walked through the door. Jamal and Amina Johnson, a married couple in their early 30s, were dressed to impress. Jamal wore a sleek, well-tailored navy blue suit, the fabric gleaming softly under the lights. His tie, dark and understated, was just the right balance of elegance. Amina, standing beside him, was the picture of grace in a black velvet gown, the fabric flowing effortlessly around her. The gown hugged her figure in all the right places, and the minimalist silver earrings she wore added a touch of class without drawing too much attention. She had an air of quiet confidence, and her dark brown skin seemed to glow under the lights, her smile radiant. The couple had spent years building their careers, Jamal as a successful neurosurgeon and Amina as a well-respected attorney at a prestigious law firm. They had worked hard to reach this point, and their success was hard-earned. Tonight, they had come to Le Ciel Blanc to celebrate Amina's recent promotion to a senior partner at her firm. It was a moment to bask in the fruits of their labor, a quiet celebration for two people who had always believed in the value of hard work and perseverance. They were greeted by the maitre d', who, after a brief glance, led them to a table near the back of the restaurant, away from the main crowd. It was an ideal spot, private, yet with a view of the bustling room. As they sat down, the couple exchanged a smile, pleased with the evening ahead. The atmosphere was perfect. The lighting, the food, the staff, everything was impeccable. As they opened the menus, Amina leaned over to Jamal and whispered, "This is exactly what we need after all those late nights at work." Jamal, always the more laid back of the two, grinned and agreed. "Well, we've earned it. Let's enjoy the evening." As the evening unfolded, Jamal and Amina couldn't help but notice the looks they received from some of the other patrons. The room was filled with well-dressed white guests, their laughter and chatter a little louder than the usual, as though they were all part of an unspoken, exclusive group. Every once in a while, Jamal would catch someone staring at him, their gaze lingering a little too long before quickly looking away. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to the restaurant's upscale clientele. He was used to people glancing his way. He knew he and Amina were a power couple in their own right, both accomplished and successful. Still, there was something in the way people looked at them tonight that felt different. The waiter came over and took their orders, offering a selection of the restaurant's finest dishes, but before they could fully settle in, something strange happened. The maitre d', who had greeted them earlier, walked over to their table. His expression was polite but distant, and his gaze flickered toward the other tables as if seeking approval. With a practiced smile, he asked them to wait a moment. Jamal and Amina exchanged puzzled looks. Had there been a mix-up with the reservation? They hadn't expected anything out of the ordinary, but the situation seemed to shift in the air. A few minutes later, the maitre d' returned with a new message, one that caught them off guard. He explained that there had been a misunderstanding and that the table they had been seated at was actually reserved for another guest. They had to move to another area of the restaurant, away from the main floor. Jamal and Amina, though surprised, nodded politely. They didn't want to make a scene, and after all, it was just a table. What happened next, however, was a shock to their system. When the maitre d' walked them to their new table, situated further in the back, they heard whispers from the other guests. A few chuckled, while others cast glances at Jamal and Amina. The couple could feel the atmosphere shift. As they sat down, Jamal felt the familiar sting of discomfort. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just about the table. It was as though their presence was unwelcome. Minutes later, a server approached and informed them that the management had decided not to serve them after all. The reason given was polite, but the implication was clear: Le Ciel Blanc wasn't a restaurant for people like them. Their wealth, their success, it didn't matter. They weren't the right kind of clientele. The realization hit them both with a suffocating weight: it wasn't the food that was the issue, it was the color of their skin. Jamal and Amina Thompson were more than just a couple, they were a living testament to resilience, ambition, and love that defied the odds. They were a power duo, not only because of their successful careers but because of their unshakable bond that was formed in the face of adversity. Both in their early 30s, Jamal was a high-level corporate lawyer, while Amina was a renowned fashion designer known for her creativity and boldness. Together, they were the picture of success in every sense of the word. Jamal stood tall at 6 feet 2 inches, his broad shoulders and strong presence making him an imposing figure in any room. His calm demeanor and natural charisma drew people to him, making him a beloved figure among his peers and colleagues. Amina, on the other hand, was equally captivating. She was a striking woman, tall with graceful features, her deep brown eyes reflecting a mixture of kindness and confidence. She had a sharp eye for fashion, often turning heads with her bold, yet effortlessly chic sense of style. Together, they were a dynamic pair, admired for both their personal and professional accomplishments. Their success wasn't just marked by what they had achieved, it was about the obstacles they had overcome. Jamal, raised in a working-class neighborhood, had fought tooth and nail to get into law school, facing countless challenges along the way. Amina, an immigrant from a small island nation, had struggled to build a career in an industry known for its exclusivity and barriers. They both understood what it meant to fight for a seat at the table, to prove to the world that they were worthy of success, no matter their skin color. But despite their shared dreams and hard-earned success, the couple's journey was far from easy. The world they navigated was often a harsh one, full of racial biases, microaggressions, and unspoken barriers. Being a successful black couple in an often predominantly white, elitist world meant that they were no strangers to the subtle discrimination that simmered beneath the surface. But Jamal and Amina were undeterred. They had faced discrimination before, growing up in an unjust world, and they weren't going to let it stop them now. Their love was more than just a private affair, it was a beacon of what was possible when two people truly cared for each other, when love transcended boundaries and rose above societal expectations. Amina often referred to Jamal as her rock, the one person who truly understood the struggles she faced not just as a woman, but as a black woman in a competitive, and often unforgiving, world. Jamal, in turn, admired Amina for her intelligence, her resilience, and the quiet strength she exuded every day. Their relationship wasn't perfect, of course. Like any couple, they had their differences and their moments of tension. But their foundation, respect, trust, and an unwavering support for one another, held strong. And through it all, they had each other. On the day of the tragic event, they were dressed to impress. Jamal wore a tailored suit, the rich fabric clinging to his broad chest and tapering down to show off his athletic build. His dark skin contrasted perfectly with the crisp white shirt and deep red tie he wore. Amina was equally stunning in her form-fitting black dress, adorned with gold accents that highlighted her toned silhouette. Her hair was styled in sleek waves, and her makeup was expertly done, enhancing her natural beauty. They looked like royalty, as they always did when they were together. They were a power couple, walking into the restaurant that night full of excitement. The evening was supposed to be a simple, celebratory dinner, the kind they had often enjoyed before. A chance for Jamal to wind down from a busy workweek, a moment for Amina to discuss the latest developments in her fashion line, and an opportunity for them to simply relax and enjoy each other's company. But as they made their way to the entrance of the restaurant, dressed impeccably and radiating a quiet confidence, neither Jamal or Amina could have anticipated the storm that was about to hit. What began as a normal night out would quickly turn into a test of their patience, dignity, and ultimately their ability to fight back against a world that wasn't always ready to accept them, no matter how successful or well-dressed they were. Little did they know, the challenges they would soon face would not be the kinds of battles they were accustomed to fighting. The fight to be heard, to be seen, to be respected as equals, would take on a new meaning that night. Jamal and Amina sat frozen for a moment, the quiet hum of the restaurant now a distant echo in their minds. The weight of what had just transpired sank in slowly, like a creeping fog. The server's words echoed in their heads, "I'm sorry, but we're unable to serve you tonight." It wasn't just the awkwardness of being asked to leave. No, it was the sense that their presence here, in the finest restaurant in the city, had been deemed unwelcome, not because of their behavior or attire, but because of who they were. Amina looked around the restaurant as she sat back in her chair. Every table seemed to be filled with the same type of people, rich, white, and powerful. It was as though they all had an unspoken bond that she and Jamal didn't belong to. They had been walking into this restaurant expecting an evening of joy and celebration, but now it felt like they were intruders. She could feel the weight of every lingering stare. Jamal, ever the calm one, turned to Amina with a quiet but firm expression. "Let's not let this ruin our night. Let's go somewhere else." But Amina was silent. Her thoughts raced as she surveyed the room. She thought about the years they'd spent building their careers. Jamal had worked tirelessly as a renowned neurosurgeon, and she had put in decades of work as a corporate lawyer. They were successful, they were wealthy, and they were respected in their own right. Yet none of that seemed to matter tonight. The message was clear: you don't belong here. The server, a young woman in a crisp uniform, stood awkwardly nearby, waiting for a response. Her demeanor was polite, but there was a discomfort in her eyes, a sign that she, too, knew what was happening was wrong but perhaps had no power to change it. "Excuse me," Jamal said finally, breaking the silence, "we're paying customers, and we've done nothing wrong to warrant this treatment. Why are we being asked to leave?" The server hesitated, looking around the restaurant, unsure of how to respond. She had been instructed to ask them to leave, but she wasn't prepared for this confrontation. After a moment, she replied with an almost apologetic tone, "I'm sorry, sir. It's just that, we've been told that this table is reserved for someone else. We can't serve you here tonight." Amina's fists clenched under the table. It wasn't just the insult of being told to leave, it was the subtle racism embedded in her refusal to even offer an explanation. It was as if they were invisible to the world of the restaurant, a world that prided itself on its exclusivity and elite status, where people of their complexion simply didn't fit. Jamal stood up, trying to keep his composure, but his voice had a sharp edge to it now. "So, you're telling me that because of the color of our skin, we're being treated like this?" Before the server could respond, another voice cut in, this one more authoritative. The restaurant's manager, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, approached their table. His expression was cold, his stance rigid. "I'm afraid that's correct," he said, his voice tinged with an almost condescending politeness. "We reserve the right to choose who we serve, and our customers expect a certain type of ambience here. We're not prepared to accommodate everyone." Jamal's jaw clenched. Amina felt her heart race. She had experienced racism before, but this was different. This was blatant and unapologetic, served up as a refusal, not a conversation. The fact that they had been treated this way in front of everyone, while others around them seemed oblivious to the injustice unfolding, made it all the more enraging. "How can you stand here and tell me that we don't belong here?" Amina finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with disbelief. "You know nothing about us. You don't know how hard we've worked to get where we are, to have this night, to enjoy a moment of peace. Yet you dismiss us without a second thought, based on nothing but prejudice." The manager, his face now reddening, tried to offer a feigned look of sympathy. "I understand your frustration, but this is simply how things are in places like this. It's just how it works." For the first time, Jamal spoke with a tinge of anger. "No. It doesn't work like that. We work for our place in this world, just like anyone else. And you, sitting up here behind your walls of privilege, have no idea what it's like to be judged simply because of the color of your skin." Amina stood up from the table, looking at the manager one last time, her eyes unwavering. "You have no right to treat us this way. But rest assured, this will not be forgotten." Jamal gently placed a hand on her shoulder, sensing the tension building. "Let's go, Amina. We don't need this. But mark my words, this isn't over." As they walked toward the exit, the manager stood rooted to his spot, knowing full well that his words, his actions, had crossed a line. The patrons sitting nearby continued their meals, oblivious to the injustice that had just unfolded before them. The door to Lucille Blanc closed behind Jamal and Amina with a sharp finality. As they stepped out into the cool night air, they both felt the sting of injustice, but they also knew this moment would not define them. It would fuel them, drive them to fight back, to ensure that no one would be treated like this again, no matter who they were or where they came from. This was only the beginning. As Jamal and Amina stepped out of Lucille Blanc, the chilly night air hit their faces like a sharp slap. Amina's mind raced, her thoughts clouded with disbelief. How had they ended up in this position? How had a simple night out become a battleground for something far deeper, something rooted in the ugliness of racism? She could feel the tightness in her chest, the anger that had begun to rise in her, and the weight of the humiliation that was settling like a heavy cloak. Jamal, walking beside her, was eerily calm. He could feel the same surge of frustration, but he kept his cool, pushing forward with steady steps. He had learned to fight his battles without resorting to the impulsive, raw anger that many expected from someone in his position. But tonight? Tonight, he felt his composure slipping. As they walked to their car, neither said anything. Amina wanted to scream, to demand answers, to lash out at the injustice they had faced. But she didn't. Instead, she clutched the keys in her hand tightly, feeling the sharp edges bite into her palm. Jamal kept walking, his mind working through the scenario that had just unfolded, each step crunching against the gravel beneath their feet. They had just reached their car when a voice called out to them from behind. Amina's breath hitched. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to see anyone from the restaurant again, especially not the manager or any of the patrons who had quietly observed their exit. But it wasn't the manager. It was someone they hadn't expected. A man, dressed in an expensive suit, was jogging toward them. His face was partially obscured by a large pair of sunglasses, but there was something familiar about his presence. As he got closer, Jamal recognized him, a regular at a high-end gym Jamal frequented. This was Eric Dawson, an influential businessman, who often appeared in the news for his deals, his investments, and his social presence. Jamal had only exchanged pleasantries with him a few times, but tonight, Eric was coming toward them with an unexpected urgency. Jamal. Amina. Wait up. Eric's voice was loud enough to draw the attention of a few passers-by. Amina looked at Jamal with uncertainty. Neither of them expected an interaction like this after the scene at the restaurant. What could he possibly want now? Eric stopped a few feet from them, his breath slightly ragged from the quick walk. He pulled off his sunglasses, revealing an intense look in his eyes. I'm really sorry about what happened back there. Save it, Jamal cut him off, his voice firm. He wasn't in the mood for explanations. You saw what went down, and you didn't do anything. Not one word of protest. Eric looked at the ground for a moment, his face reddening. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder before meeting Jamal's gaze again. I didn't know it was going to go like that, man. Honestly, I was just here for dinner. I saw the whole thing unfold, and I'm sorry I didn't stand up. But I can't just sit here and let this pass. Amina narrowed her eyes. What exactly are you trying to say? Eric hesitated. Look, I've been in these kinds of situations before. I get it. But I also know how these things work. You don't want to go through this the wrong way. You're just going to get the attention of people who don't need it. Jamal's anger flared. So now you're telling us we should just let it slide, let it go, and ignore what just happened. Do you realize what this means for us? His voice raised slightly, his frustration bubbling up. You're telling us, because of the color of our skin, we don't have the same right to dine in a restaurant as anyone else. And you think that's something we should just let go? Amina stepped closer to Jamal, her hand resting on his arm, a silent plea for him to calm down. But her own emotions were just as tangled. She knew where this was headed, and it wasn't a direction they could afford to ignore. Her voice, though softer than Jamal's, was filled with sharp edges. It's about more than just a bad experience, Eric. It's about something much deeper than that. Racism isn't just a word. It's a reality. Eric's expression hardened, but he seemed to realize the weight of what they were saying. His face, usually so composed, now held an expression of discomfort. I didn't mean to offend you, he muttered. But what do you want from me? You want me to say it was wrong? Because I do. It was wrong, but the truth is, there's nothing I can do about it. Amina's voice trembled as she spoke, the frustration and hurt bubbling to the surface. What do you mean, there's nothing you can do? You were sitting there, you were a witness, and you didn't say anything. You just kept eating your dinner, while they treated us like we were invisible. You're just as guilty as they are. And you think nothing can be done? Eric took a step back, clearly unsettled. His eyes darted nervously, his earlier confidence evaporating. He cleared his throat. I just don't want to get involved, okay? You know how people will react. Amina felt her chest tighten as the reality of the situation hit her again. She turned to Jamal, her expression reflecting the deep pain she was trying to hide. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about the system. It's about how people like Eric here, people who could stand up and say something, choose not to because they're afraid of being uncomfortable. Jamal stood silently for a long moment, then gave a short nod. It's not just about tonight. It's about everything. It's about how people in power decide who matters and who doesn't. He turned his gaze back to Eric, who now stood there, clearly unsure how to proceed. You've done your part, Jamal finally said, his tone flat. Now it's time for us to do ours. With that, Jamal and Amina turned away, leaving Eric standing in the parking lot, an uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. They didn't need to explain further. The words, the feeling, the truth of what had happened in Lucille Blanc, it was clear. It was a moment that would not be forgotten, and it was one that would push them to fight for what was right. As they walked away, the city's skyline loomed in the distance, and with each step they took, they knew they wouldn't stop until this kind of injustice was a thing of the past. The night had taken a turn no one could have predicted. What began as a simple, albeit tense, exchange of words quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. Eric stood still, watching Jamal and Amina as they walked away, his own discomfort still lingering. But neither of them noticed him anymore. They had more important things on their minds. Jamal's hand gripped Amina's tightly as they walked towards their car. Their faces were set, their minds far from the small parking lot they were leaving behind. They were deep in thought, trying to process what had happened in that restaurant, trying to make sense of the anger, the injustice, and their now painful reality. But as they approached their car, the parking lot seemed eerily silent. The sounds of their footsteps on the asphalt were the only noise for a moment. And then, as they reached the driver's side, a sound broke the silence, a loud crash, followed by the screeching of tires. Before they could react, a car sped around the corner of the parking lot. Jamal barely had time to shout a warning to Amina when the vehicle, moving at an alarming speed, came careening toward them. The car struck Amina with a sickening thud. Jamal's heart stopped. His mind couldn't process what had just happened. One moment, Amina was beside him, her hand in his, the next, she was crumpled against the hood of a car, her body twisting unnaturally as it slid off the front bumper and fell to the ground. Everything happened so fast. The driver slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. Amina lay motionless, her breathing shallow and ragged. Jamal rushed to her side, his hands shaking as he touched her skin, feeling for a pulse. It was faint, barely there. Amina! Amina! He screamed, his voice cracking as he cradled her in his arms. The driver, a man who appeared as shocked as Jamal, was already out of the car, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He was white, disheveled, and clearly panicked. He muttered apologies, but his words were barely comprehensible. "I didn't mean to. I didn't see you." Jamal didn't hear him. His focus was solely on Amina, whose face had gone pale as the life drained from her. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, a brief flicker of recognition crossing her features before they closed again. Jamal's thoughts spiraled out of control. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not after everything they'd fought through together. His heart pounded in his chest, and his head swam with fear. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and called for an ambulance, his voice desperate. "Amina, stay with me. Stay with me," Jamal whispered through his tears. He tried to apply pressure to the wound, but his mind was clouded with the overwhelming sense of helplessness. The ambulance arrived minutes later, but by the time the paramedics loaded her into the vehicle, it was already too late. Amina had succumbed to her injuries, her life slipping away in that brief moment of carelessness. The driver of the car, meanwhile, stood off to the side, still in shock. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had killed someone. He knew it, and there was no escaping that reality. Jamal was consumed with a deep, numbing rage. His anger wasn't just for the driver, it was for the injustice, the senselessness of it all. They had been wronged in that restaurant, humiliated for nothing more than the color of their skin, and now, Amina was gone, taken from him because of the negligence of someone who hadn't even tried to pay attention. The police arrived shortly after, and the chaos of the situation became even more pronounced. The driver was arrested on the spot for vehicular manslaughter, though it seemed almost trivial given what had happened. Amina was gone, and nothing in the world could bring her back. Jamal was left standing in the parking lot, his eyes fixed on the spot where Amina had fallen, the sirens and flashing lights blurring into the background. The night that had promised to be nothing more than a painful reminder of racial inequality had now turned into a personal tragedy, a loss so great, so unfair, that it felt as though the world itself had conspired against him. The rest of the evening was a blur. The police took statements, took the driver away, and later released Jamal from the scene, but his thoughts never stopped racing. All he could think about was Amina, her smile, her laughter, her dreams. now all extinguished in a senseless act. And just like that, the fight he had fought so hard to win, the love he had cherished, had all come crashing down. In the days that followed, the reality of Amina's death settled in with crushing weight. There would be no more moments shared with her, no more laughter, no more dreams. The injustice of it all, the racism, the disregard for their lives, and now, this, felt unbearable. But Jamal wasn't going to let it stand. He couldn't. He would fight for Amina, for their love, for the future that had been stolen from them. And when the world tried to tell him it was over, when the world tried to sweep the truth under the rug, he would rise again. For Amina. For justice. And for a future where no one had to face the kind of violence and hate that had taken her from him. The events that transpired in the luxurious restaurant rippled out in ways that Jamal and Amina could never have foreseen. The night that started with excitement and anticipation had turned into a painful reminder of the racial divide that still existed in society. The moment the hostess turned them away, the disbelief they felt quickly turned to anger, and that anger, in turn, sparked something much greater. As Jamal and Amina left the restaurant, they were both seething with frustration. They had been humiliated, not because of their appearance or their behavior, but because of the color of their skin. The incident was not just an isolated moment, it was a reflection of a deeper, more insidious problem that affected so many black people in their daily lives. The barrier that existed between the wealthy elite and people of color was not just about money, it was about a culture of exclusion, of assumptions and prejudices that were embedded into society's fabric. The couple had been used to facing microaggressions throughout their lives. They had seen it in the way people assumed they didn't belong in high-end stores, or the way their accomplishments were sometimes dismissed as exceptions. But this was different. This wasn't just one more slight to brush off, it was a blatant reminder that no matter how successful they became, no matter how much they dressed to impress, they would still be treated as less than by some. Jamal was the first to speak, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Amina, this can't be how it is. We worked so hard, we've proven ourselves, and this is what we get. Amina, holding back tears, placed a hand on his arm. I know. But we can't just let it go. This isn't just about us, it's about everyone. It's about every black person who's ever been told they don't belong. This is bigger than us. Their shared resolve was evident. They weren't going to let this slide. As much as they wanted to forget it and walk away, they both knew this was a turning point. The injustice of that moment needed to be confronted, not just for them, but for the countless others who faced discrimination without ever speaking up. The next day, Jamal and Amina began their campaign for change. They didn't know what exactly the outcome would be, but they were determined to make sure their voices were heard. They used their platform, Jamal's connections in the legal world, Amina's influence in the fashion industry, to spread the word. They called out the restaurant publicly, and soon the story caught fire. Local news outlets picked up on the scandal, and social media exploded with reactions from people who had experienced similar discrimination or who simply couldn't stand to see such blatant prejudice in a supposedly inclusive world. For Jamal and Amina, the aftermath was both empowering and exhausting. They faced both support and backlash. Some stood with them, sharing their outrage, while others criticized them for making a scene. But for every comment of vitriol, there were dozens of voices demanding change. People from all walks of life rallied behind the couple's cause, sharing stories of their own experiences with racism in spaces that were supposed to be open and welcoming. Soon, the story went viral. The restaurant faced immense pressure, with people calling for boycotts and protests outside its doors. The owners, who had initially tried to downplay the incident, were forced to address it publicly. They issued an apology, but the damage was done. The incident had sparked a larger conversation about race, privilege, and exclusion in high-end venues, and the calls for accountability had only grown louder. Jamal and Amina, however, were not content with just an apology. They demanded systemic change. They began working with advocacy groups to push for legislation that would enforce anti-discrimination policies in the hospitality and luxury industries. They also began collaborating with other activists and organizations to help people who had been marginalized, offering resources for those who didn't have the platform or voice to challenge the discrimination they faced. The couple also started a charity, one focused on educating both young people and adults about racism, privilege, and empathy. They traveled around the country speaking at events, using their experience to fuel change. The campaign was never just about a restaurant or about their personal grievances, it became a symbol of how deeply rooted racism still was in society and how much work was left to be done. Throughout this process, Jamal and Amina never lost sight of why they were doing it. They wanted to create a world where their children, and every child of color, would be able to walk into any room and be seen for who they were, not judged by the color of their skin. They didn't want to just change the laws, they wanted to change hearts and minds. And slowly but surely, change started to happen. More businesses began implementing better diversity and inclusion policies. People began listening, really listening, to the stories of Black and other marginalized communities. Jamal and Amina had ignited a fire for change, a movement that had only just begun. Their fight was far from over, but it was clear that the world was starting to notice. What had started as a personal injustice had become a catalyst for a broader movement, one that would continue to challenge racism wherever it lived, from the smallest corners of society to the most exclusive institutions. Jamal and Amina's fight for justice was not just for them, it was for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. As Jamal and Amina's campaign for change gained momentum, they found themselves at the forefront of a much larger movement, one that wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the countless people who had suffered in silence, the voices that had been silenced by discrimination for far too long. Jamal and Amina knew that their own struggle could be a catalyst, but it could only be successful if they helped others find their voices, too. The first step in their journey toward empowerment was creating spaces for dialogue. They understood that, while their personal experience had sparked the movement, it was the collective stories of marginalized people that would sustain it. They wanted to create an atmosphere where people, especially those who had been oppressed, felt safe to share their stories, to speak out, and to be heard. To do this, they hosted community events in both local neighborhoods and online platforms. They partnered with organizations that supported racial justice and inequality, offering their platform to those who had been denied a seat at the table. These events became a haven for people to share not only their experiences with racism, but also their dreams, aspirations, and ideas for a more equitable society. One of the most moving moments during these gatherings was when Jamal and Amina invited a group of young Black children to speak about what they wanted for their futures. They listened with rapt attention as the children talked about wanting to be doctors, lawyers, and scientists, careers they had been told were out of reach because of their skin color. These kids, with their bright eyes and hopeful smiles, were the future, and Jamal and Amina realized how important it was to nurture that potential. At one of the events, a young woman named Tanya shared her experience of being passed over for promotions in her corporate job, despite being more qualified than her white colleagues. As she spoke, her voice trembled, but her words were powerful. She revealed that for years, she had swallowed the pain, fearing retaliation and never thinking anyone would believe her. But with Jamal and Amina's support, she felt brave enough to speak out. Her courage became an example for others who had suffered in silence. Tanya wasn't just telling her story, she was taking back her power. Through these community events, Jamal and Amina offered practical resources as well. They helped individuals access legal aid, job placement services, and mentorship programs. But more importantly, they fostered a sense of solidarity. They were showing people that they weren't alone, and together, they could dismantle the systems that perpetuated racial injustice. The couple also made sure to engage with businesses directly. They called out companies that perpetuated discriminatory practices but also rewarded those who took meaningful steps to promote diversity and inclusion. It wasn't just about pointing fingers, it was about creating a space for accountability. When a restaurant or a corporation did right by its employees and customers, Jamal and Amina highlighted it, encouraging other businesses to follow suit. While Jamal and Amina led this charge, they knew that real change couldn't happen if they weren't amplifying the voices of those who had been marginalized for generations. They partnered with well-established civil rights leaders and activists, joining their efforts to push for systemic change in education, healthcare, the criminal justice system, and corporate America. But they also made room for new voices, particularly younger activists who had lived the experience of discrimination in more subtle forms, like microaggressions in the workplace or racial profiling by law enforcement. Through these efforts, Jamal and Amina saw a change in the community. What began as a small act of resistance had turned into a movement of empowerment. More and more people were sharing their stories, speaking out against injustice, and organizing for change. They began to see that systemic racism wasn't an issue that could be solved by one group or one voice, it was a collective effort. The power wasn't just in the leaders at the top, but in the everyday people who came together to demand change. The movement sparked conversations across the country, on social media, in schools, and even in boardrooms. Jamal and Amina had ignited something bigger than themselves. They had helped to build a foundation for a new era of advocacy where the voiceless were no longer silenced, where their stories mattered, and where they could take charge of their own destinies. However, the fight was far from over. Jamal and Amina continued to push for legislation that would require diversity and inclusion training in schools and workplaces. They advocated for policy changes that would ensure equal pay for Black employees, better healthcare for marginalized communities, and greater representation in all sectors of society. But in all their advocacy, they never lost sight of the core message, that true change comes not only from legislation, but from a shift in how people see each other. Amina often reflected on the children they had spoken with, bright, hopeful, and ready to take on the world, and realized that building bridges wasn't just about closing the racial gap in the workplace or education, it was about teaching the next generation that we are all deserving of respect, regardless of the color of our skin. As Jamal and Amina's journey continued, they became an inspiration to people all over the world. They showed that even the smallest acts of resistance, whether standing up for yourself in the face of prejudice, sharing your story, or using your platform to amplify others, could create a ripple effect of change. The fight for racial equality was ongoing, but Jamal and Amina had built the foundation for a new, more inclusive world, one where every voice was heard and every person mattered. As Jamal and Amina continued their advocacy for racial equality, they realized that their efforts were no longer just about themselves or their community, it was about a global movement. The mission had expanded far beyond local rallies and conversations. The world was waking up to the importance of dismantling the systems of oppression that had existed for centuries. But the fight was far from over. It was at one of their largest community gatherings that the couple decided to deliver a message of unity and collective strength. They stood together on stage, facing a diverse crowd of people who had come from all walks of life to join the movement. The sound of cheers and applause filled the air, but beneath it, there was a deeper understanding that the moment they were in was historic. They weren't just speaking to an audience, they were speaking for future generations. Amina, with her unwavering strength and gentle demeanor, began by addressing the crowd, her words flowing effortlessly but carrying the weight of years of struggle and advocacy. "We are here today not as individuals, but as a collective force," she began, her voice steady yet full of emotion. "The fight for racial equality is not just a Black fight, it's a fight for all of us. It's about breaking down the barriers that divide us and understanding that, despite our differences, we are all human beings deserving of respect and dignity." Jamal, standing beside her, added, "This movement isn't about one moment in time. It's about creating a future where equality isn't something we have to fight for, it's something we live. We live in a world where children should never have to worry about their skin color, where people should never be discriminated against because of how they look, who they love, or where they come from." The crowd fell into a hushed silence as Jamal and Amina's words hung in the air. It was a collective realization that the journey wasn't just about changing laws, it was about changing hearts and minds. They were asking for more than policy reforms. They were asking for empathy, understanding, and the willingness to see one another as equals. Amina continued, her eyes scanning the crowd, this is not a journey for just one group of people. It's a journey for all of us. Black, white, brown, Asian, we must all stand together to fight for a future where everyone is treated equally. It is about amplifying each other's voices. It's about standing up when we see injustice, regardless of who the victim is. The world doesn't change by one person, it changes when we come together and demand that the world reflect our shared values of respect, kindness, and humanity. Jamal stepped forward, his voice filled with passion, when we unite as one, there is no force that can stop us. Each of us has a role to play. Whether it's using your voice, your resources, or your time, we must all contribute to this cause. The movement is only as strong as the unity that binds it together. The couple paused as the crowd cheered, but the message was clear. They weren't just advocating for Black people, they were advocating for a united, inclusive world where racial discrimination could not survive. The event wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. Jamal and Amina used the platform to showcase the work of those who had been part of the movement for years and those who had recently found their voices. They invited activists, educators, and even ordinary people who had experienced discrimination to share their stories. Their stories were not just told, they were celebrated. They were woven into the fabric of the movement, amplifying the message that every voice mattered. Jamal and Amina also used the event to raise funds for programs that promoted diversity in education and the workplace, as well as initiatives aimed at combating police brutality and improving healthcare for marginalized communities. Their efforts were not limited to the fight for racial justice in one community, they were global, stretching across borders, continents, and cultures. As the event came to a close, Amina and Jamal shared a final thought with the crowd. Unity is our strength, Amina said, her voice soft but resolute. It's not enough to simply say we are united. We must show up for each other, every single day. We must protect each other's rights, uplift each other's voices, and ensure that everyone, no matter the color of their skin, their gender, their sexuality, or their background, has a place in this world. The crowd erupted into applause once more, and Jamal and Amina walked off stage hand in hand, knowing that their message of unity had reached a deeper place within each of those gathered. It was a message that transcended race, transcended nationality, and transcended time. It was a call for humanity to come together, to stand united in the fight for justice, and to create a world where everyone, regardless of their background, could live freely and equally. The work ahead would be long and challenging, but the momentum they had built together could not be stopped. They had lit a spark, and now it was up to everyone to keep the fire burning. In that moment, Jamal and Amina knew that their mission was far from complete. But they also knew that they had made a significant step toward a future of equality, where people of all races, backgrounds, and identities could thrive together in peace. And it was that vision of a united world, a world of equality, that would continue to drive their efforts for the rest of their lives.